What if a mysterious object carved into ancient stone wasn't just symbolic, but something we still don't fully understand today? Across multiple ancient civilizations, separated by thousands of kilometers and thousands of years, archaeologists keep finding the same strange object. It looks like a small bag with a handle. And the most surprising part is how consistent the design is, no matter where it appears. The most well-known examples come from ancient Mesopotamia, especially from the Sumerian and later Assyrian civilizations, dating back over 3,000 years. In detailed stone reliefs, human-like figures and winged beings are shown holding a small bucket-shaped object with a clearly defined handle. These figures are often identified as apkallu, mythological beings associated with wisdom and ritual practices. In many cases, they are shown next to sacred trees, performing what appear to be ceremonial actions. The object itself is almost always depicted the same way. It has a rigid structure, a flat base, and a curved handle that fits perfectly in one hand. This level of consistency is unusual for symbolic art, where shapes often vary depending on the artist or time period. Here, the proportions remain nearly identical across different carvings, suggesting that the object had a specific and recognizable form. In many scenes, the bag appears together with another object that looks like a pine cone. Researchers believe this combination may represent a ritual practice, possibly involving sprinkling water or oils. Based on ancient texts, the most widely accepted explanation is that these objects were ceremonial containers, sometimes described as ritual buckets used in purification ceremonies. But this explanation starts to break down when similar shapes appear outside Mesopotamia. At Göbekli Tepe, one of the oldest known archaeological sites in the world, dating back over 11,000 years, carvings include symbols that closely resemble the same bag-like form. This is thousands of years older than Sumerian civilization. Even more surprising, similar shapes have been identified in Mesoamerican cultures, including early Olmec carvings. These civilizations developed independently, with no confirmed contact between them. Yet the object looks strikingly similar. That raises a difficult question. Why would completely separate cultures depict nearly identical objects? One explanation is symbolic convergence, where different civilizations independently create similar symbols to represent the same idea. A container holding something important or sacred is a concept that could emerge in multiple places. But the precision of the design makes this harder to fully accept. The object does not just look symbolic, it looks functional. The handle is proportioned in a way that suggests it was meant to be carried. The base appears stable, as if it could be placed on a surface. The overall design resembles a real object more than an abstract symbol. This has led some researchers to question whether we are missing part of the picture. More speculative theories suggest the object could represent lost technology or tools that no longer exist. Others believe it may symbolize knowledge, power, or some kind of transfer between humans and the divine. However, there is no physical evidence to support these ideas. No actual object matching this exact design has ever been recovered. And that detail is important. If these were common tools, we would expect to find at least one surviving example. The fact that we only see them in carvings suggests they may have been ceremonial, rare, or even symbolic representations of something that was never meant to be preserved physically. Another key detail is who is holding them. In almost every example, the object is carried by important or mythological figures, not ordinary people. This suggests it had a specific meaning or role, possibly tied to status, ritual authority, or religious practice. Today, the most accepted explanation remains that these were ritual objects used in ceremonies. But that does not fully explain their consistent design or their appearance across different cultures and time periods. The Sumerian bag remains one of those rare cases in archaeology where the object is clearly visible, widely documented, and still not fully understood. It is not hidden or obscure. It appears in some of the most studied sites in the world. And yet, there is still no single explanation that accounts for all the evidence. Sometimes the mystery is not in what we cannot see, but in what we see too often without fully understanding it.
Deep in Petra's Red Cliffs, archaeologists found a hidden tomb. Inside, there were 12 skeletons. They remained untouched for over 2,000 years, and that's a really weird thing. Most tombs in Petra have been looted, so what makes this find stand out? Let's figure it out. This is the ancient city of Petra. Its huge sandstone cliffs are hard to forget. No wonder it's one of the new 7 wonders of the world. The buildings here are carved straight into the rock, and it already makes the place look unreal. But Petra has also been a star in the archaeology world for a long time. Once, Petra appeared in the movie Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. Some scenes were filmed right in front of the famous building called Al-Khazneh, or the Treasury. But recently, something even more exciting happened there in real life. A TV team from the show Expedition Unknown came to Petra to film a new investigation. And while they were there, archaeologists made a huge discovery. They found 12 human skeletons and several ancient objects. All of them were buried under the ground in front of the treasury, hidden there for about 2,000 years. Archaeologists didn't start digging right away. First, they used a special tool called ground-penetrating radar, something like an X-ray for the ground. Instead of guessing where to dig, the machine scans underground and shows shapes that might be tombs or empty spaces. Anyway, when the team looked at the radar data, something interesting showed up. The patterns looked very similar to places in Petra where tombs had already been found before. That was a big clue that something might be hiding underground. After seeing the results, the authorities of Jordan gave permission for the excavation. That's when the team finally started digging under the famous site. And that's how they uncovered the skeletons and ancient artifacts. Interestingly, many tombs in Petra have been found completely empty, because over the centuries, anything valuable was taken by looters, or simply disappeared with time. But this tomb was very different. Inside, the team discovered 12 human skeletons and a few ancient objects. Some of the bones even had mold on them. That happened because Petra is carved into sandstone cliffs. Sandstone is quite porous, which means it can soak up water like a giant sponge. The area sometimes floods, and moisture likely slowly made its way into the tomb. Along with the skeletons, the archaeologists found stuff made of bronze, iron, and ceramic. One object stood out, a ceramic chalice resting in the arms of one of the buried people. It was almost as if the person had been holding it when they were laid to rest. Mysteriously, the cup looked a lot like the Holy Grail from the Indiana Jones movie. The famous building above the tomb, the Al-Khazneh, stands near the main entrance to the city. It's believed to be at least 2,000 years old. This huge structure is carved directly into the sandstone cliffs. Today, it's one of the most recognizable landmarks in the world. But even though the treasury is so famous, archaeologists still don't fully understand its history. One reason is that many of the nearby tombs didn't contain many artifacts, and without things to study, it becomes much harder to figure out exactly when the building was made or how it was used. That's why the team was so excited. The discovery could help them learn more about the ancient people who lived in Petra and built the city. The location of the tomb might already be an important clue. You see, being buried right in front of the treasury was probably a huge honor. The human remains themselves could also tell an interesting story. The skeletons were still lying in their original positions without being moved around or disturbed by looters. That's why scientists can study them much more carefully to learn things like how old these people were, how they lived, or if they were healthy. We could also learn more about the place those people called home, the ancient city of Petra. It was built more than 2,000 years ago by the Nabateans. Starting around the 4th century BCE, this desert city became the center of their kingdom and an important stop for trade across the Middle East. The location helped a lot. Petra sits in a valley surrounded by mountains, and the main entrance is a long, narrow canyon called the Al-Sik. Because the path is so tight, the city was easy to defend and hard for enemies to attack. Thanks to these factors, the city grew quickly. At its peak, around 30,000 people may have lived there, but the city sits in a dry desert canyon. Natural water is kinda limited there. So how did so many people live in Petra? The answer is clever engineering. The Nabateans built a water system that was incredibly advanced for its time. They didn't rely on one water source. It was a whole network carved directly into the rock. They cut channels, pipes, and storage tanks into the cliffs. This helped them guide water from nearby springs into the city. It was like an ancient plumbing system built entirely out of stone. Even better, the water didn't just flow straight into the city. First, it passed through special settling basins where dirt and sand could sink to the bottom. After that, the water was stored in large reservoirs surrounded by thick stone walls, which helped keep the water cooler in the desert heat. Flash floods were also a big danger in the canyon. When heavy rain fell in the surrounding mountains, water often rushed down the narrow valleys. To deal with that, the Nabateans built dams and channels that redirected the floodwater into storage reservoirs. Another intriguing thing about Petra is the location of its main buildings. In 2013, researchers found that several important monuments lined up with the sun during key moments of the year, like the solstices and equinoxes. Scientists now believe that the buildings may have worked like giant calendars, helping people track the seasons in a desert landscape. Natural signs of time can be hard to notice there. Another Petra mystery is three massive stone blocks, the Jinn blocks. They go back to around the 2nd century BCE and are some of the first big tombs built in Petra. Two of them have burial chambers inside, and the third one even has a grave on top, like a little rooftop coffin. No one really knows exactly why they were built. Most experts say they were tombs, but some think they may have been carved to honor deities or used in rituals. But however great Petra was, things started to change in 106 CE. That's when the powerful Roman Empire took control of the city and made it part of their territory. Trade didn't completely stop, but the city slowly lost some of its importance. Later, a large earthquake in 551 CE caused serious damage to the area. It could have been the final blow for a city that was already in decline. Over time, Petra was eventually abandoned and became known as the Lost City. But there's another nickname people used much more often, the Rose City. The name comes from the color of the cliffs around Petra. The sandstone rocks have a reddish-pink color, especially when the sun is low in the sky. What tourists see today is just a tiny slice of Petra. Some estimates say archaeologists have only dug up about 15% of the city. Visitors go through the narrow Sik, gape at the 130-foot-high treasury, walk along tomb-lined streets, and climb over 800 steps to reach the monastery, Al-Dir. But that's like seeing the tip of an iceberg. The rest is still buried. Petra keeps surprising us. In 2016, researchers used satellite images to spot a huge, previously unknown monument. The platform is massive, about 184 by 161 feet, and has columns along one side. Pottery fragments suggest it's over 2,150 years old. So basically, even after centuries of exploration, Petra is still full of secrets. They're just waiting to be uncovered. We all know how it goes. Homo sapiens are way smarter than Neanderthals. Neanderthals were primitive, and we're much cooler than they were, right? Now, what comes to mind when you hear the word factory? Probably something like this. Lots of Homo sapiens, people, working in different departments, huge production lines, packaging, sorting. You can't fit a Neanderthal into that image, can you? Hey, don't be such an evolutionist. We don't judge people here by the stage of their development, okay? And by the way, Neanderthals had their own impressive factories. No conveyors or industrial robots, but pretty advanced for their time. The production line I'm talking about was located in a place we now call Germany. What's funny is that it's a country that still has plenty of factories and a long tradition of working with machinery, so it feels like a continuation of that tradition. Now, poof, back 125,000 years, to the moment when this very early factory appeared. Around this time, Earth was in an interglacial period, with weather quite similar to today's climate, so conditions may have not been the best, but still fairly comfortable. Neanderthals lived their ordinary lives. They used fire to manage vegetation, gathered plants, and apparently, built plants. Pun intended. So if you thought those hairy guys were savage beasts who spent their time scratching lice off their skin, you may owe an apology to this distinguished gentleman. By the way, this is Carl, and he claims to be the owner of this factory. You seem to have underestimated him, so he's left. But I'll carry on talking about this interglacial breakthrough. Archaeologists have recently shown that Neanderthals intentionally chose a lakeside location to process the bones of at least 172 mammals, including deer, horses, and aurochs, a now extinct species of bovine. The study demonstrates that the inhabitants not only broke open large mammal bones to extract marrow, but also ground the bones into thousands of fragments and heated them in water to extract calorie-rich bone grease. Think of it as a food manufactory making flavorful Campbell's soup ready to hit the shelves at your local supermarket. I know it sounds far-fetched, but what I want to show here is that we now have evidence that even Neanderthals had pretty advanced techniques of food processing. This was intensive, organized, and strategic. Neanderthals were clearly managing resources with precision. Some of them were planning hunts. Others were in charge of transporting carcasses, while another group was busy rendering fat in a task-specific area. They definitely had no nutritionists, but they did understand both the nutritional value of fat and how to access it efficiently. Just one example. Scientists now think that when it came down to caching carcass parts, they would do so across the landscape for later transport to the grease rendering site. You know how all factories are supposed to meet production targets? Same here. Experts believe Neanderthals understood there was a certain fat quota they needed to meet to make the literally bone-crushing process worthwhile. Now, you may say, well, it's just one example. It doesn't mean that Neanderthals were that advanced. True, good catch. However, there are more examples, and here's one of them. Technically speaking, in addition to food-related production lines, these guys may have had a chemical production factory. You see, there is evidence that Neanderthals made stone tools using a multi-ingredient adhesive, which they couldn't buy at Dollar Tree for very obvious reasons. The factory headquarters wasn't in Germany this time though, but in Gibraltar, in Vanguard Cave to be more precise. While studying this area, scientists stumbled upon a small hearth that may have functioned as something close to an ancient adhesive workshop. So chances are that Neanderthals were using fire not just for warmth or cooking, but as a controlled tool for producing useful materials. Now, let's see how this hearth worked. If you've ever cooked sauces, you know how they thicken once the temperature goes up. Neanderthals may have spotted something similar while using fire for its basic function, cooking. They put two and two together and bam, they started glue, or rather, tar production. The controlled fire helped them regulate heat precisely enough to produce a perfectly sticky texture. That tar could then be used to fasten stone blades or other sharp pieces onto wooden handles, with sinew or plant fibers helping secure the joint. If you wonder what the recipe was, scientists managed to reconstruct it, sort of. Basically, it involved burned rock rose leaves, but there was a secret ingredient for the process to work: guano. Guano is what's left of bat and bird feces once they've decayed. It sounds quite disgusting, but it worked, and that's what matters. Let's check out the structure itself. It's quite small. A round pit roughly 9 inches across and about 3.5 inches deep. Its walls are sharply cut, and 2 narrow trenches extend outward to the north and south. The working idea is that Neanderthals packed the pit with rock rose leaves, then sealed it with damp sand and soil, likely mixed with, you guessed it, guano, to limit oxygen entering the chamber. A small fire, probably fueled by grasses and shrubs, would have burned above the sealed pit. As the plant material heated, it released a thick brown resin. Producing that resin required temperatures in the neighborhood of 300 degrees Fahrenheit or more. However, it took scientists some effort to understand what happened inside the hearth. They had to analyze residues from the walls and floor using several chemical techniques, including mass spectrometry. This technique identifies and counts molecules within a sample. It was necessary to reconstruct the likely production method. Once they ran those SMART tests, they moved on to the next step, which involved a tad of elbow grease. They recreated the setup themselves, building experimental hearths that matched the original in size, shape, and materials. In 4 test runs, the recreated hearths successfully produced resin, which supported the proposed explanation. Alright, it feels like those prehistoric production lines prove that Neanderthals were much cooler than we thought. A typical idea is that Neanderthals were just wandering hunters, but they probably were not. And it's not only about their production setups. There may be evidence suggesting they organized coordinated hunts that lured wild horses into traps roughly 200,000 years ago. We go back to Germany once again. At the archaeological site of Schöningen, researchers uncovered wooden spears, double-pointed sticks, stone tools, and the butchered remains of more than 50 horses of different ages. After a couple of tests, scientists realized these finds are about 100,000 years younger than earlier estimates. The material was excavated in the 1990s from sediments along what used to be a lakeshore. With the updated dating, scientists think the site reflects a period when Neanderthals were already living across Europe. Zoo archaeologists argue that these hunters could understand horse behavior well enough to organize group hunts, steering entire horse families toward carefully chosen ambush points. Yikes! Chances are that by about 200,000 years ago, Neanderthals were cooperating in increasingly complex ways. Organized hunting, shared planning, and coordinated action may have been part of their social life, and they could have possibly reached levels similar to those seen in early Homo sapiens communities. Earlier estimates placed the Schöningen tools and horse remains at roughly 300,000 years old. There were no labels, of course, so scientists had to turn to pollen preserved in the sediment layers, which they used to match local vegetation changes with known global climate cycles. Under that older timeline, the hunters at the site might have been Neanderthal ancestors or another ancient human species known as Homo heidelbergensis. But the new timeline points more directly to Neanderthals themselves. To refine the age of the site, a team of scientists analyzed how amino acids, the chemical components of proteins, had gradually changed structure after passing. They examined 4 snail shells, 15 tiny crustaceans, and 8 horse teeth from the same sediment layer that contained the spears. Once they measured these molecular changes and combined the results with pollen records and climate data, the researchers calculated how much time had passed since those organisms died. The results consistently pointed to a younger age, around 200,000 years, placing Neanderthals squarely in the role of the hunters behind the Schöningen horse drives. 40,000 years ago, someone scratched a few tiny lines and dots onto a piece of bone, and that little mark might be the oldest hard drive humanity ever created. Scientists now believe those Ice Age people weren't just doodling, but recording real information, structured, organized, repeatable data. And this discovery completely shifts the timeline of human intelligence. For decades, archaeologists kept finding strange symbols carved into Stone Age tools and sculptures. Those were simple shapes like crosses, dots, short lines, and tiny notches cut into bone or ivory. Explorers kept finding them in caves across Europe, including Germany, France, and Spain. They showed up on carved animal figurines, tools, and ornaments. Archaeologists dated them to be about 34,000 to 45,000 years old. That means people created these symbols during the Ice Age, when glaciers covered huge chunks of the planet, and mammoths still wandered the plains. For a long time, researchers believed these signs meant nothing in particular, maybe decorations, maybe tribal art. But a new computational study led by a linguist and an archaeologist showed it was more about data than decoration. The team analyzed more than 3,000 individual symbols carved into around 260 artifacts. They studied every mark and fed them into statistical models, the same type of mathematics researchers use to study language patterns or train artificial intelligence. The goal wasn't to translate the signs yet. Nobody knows exactly what they mean. Instead, the scientists looked at something called information density, which means how much meaningful data you can store in a sequence of symbols. When the researchers ran the numbers, they saw that the symbol sequences had almost the same information density as proto-cuneiform. That's the earliest writing system known from ancient Mesopotamia around 3000 BCE. It was roughly 40,000 years later. So, some signs in these Ice Age carvings repeat again and again in predictable ways: cross, 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 line, line, dot. That repetition resembles early data encoding, where patterns repeat because they store structured information. The researchers also analyzed the entropy of the coded messages. Entropy measures how unpredictable a sequence is. High entropy means lots of possible combinations, like a complex password. Low entropy means predictable repetition, and it looks like the Ice Age symbol systems have entropy levels very close to early proto-cuneiform tablets. That means the amount of information those carvings could store roughly matches the earliest writing records from the first cities. It proves that humans didn't just suddenly invent writing out of nowhere 5,000 years ago. Instead, humans spent tens of thousands of years experimenting with symbolic encoding systems and gradually increased their complexity until true writing was finally invented. One of the most interesting examples of such a coded message comes from a cave in southwestern Germany. Archaeologists discovered a tiny mammoth figurine carved from mammoth tusk ivory, small enough to fit in your palm. There's a neat row of engraved crosses and dots running along its surface. Another object, called the adorant, is a thin ivory plate. Found in a different German cave, has a strange mythical creature that looks part human, part lion on it. The figure stretches upward like it's worshipping something, and across its body, someone carved rows of tiny dots and notches with careful spacing. Then there's the famous lion-human sculpture. If you look at the arm closely, you can see evenly spaced cuts along the limb. These marks seem intentional, deliberate, almost rhythmic. They look less like decoration and more like entries in a ledger. It makes those artifacts something like USB drives made of ivory. And because these ancient USB drives appear in different regions of Germany and in other parts of Europe, it could mean that Ice Age humans may have shared such symbolic messages across huge distances. Those hunter-gatherers living thousands of miles apart probably recognized the same patterns scratched into bone tools. Of course, scientists still don't know the exact meaning of these symbols. They could represent seasonal calendars, migration cycles, clan markers, or some concepts tied to rituals. So the most important discovery for now isn't the translation, but the structure of the signs that behave like a system. This coding system isn't the only proof that ancient minds invented complex systems long before modern technology arrived. There's a thick oval slab of limestone in a museum in the Netherlands. Archaeologists dug it up in the late 1800s and assumed it was some kind of Roman game board. The problem was that nobody could figure out the rules. The carved lines didn't match any known ancient game. Only in 2026, researchers finally solved the mystery with help from artificial intelligence. If you look at the stone closely, you can see that certain grooves on it are slightly deeper than others. It means that people slid pieces across those lines repeatedly, and the stone wore down over time. Conservation experts created extremely detailed 3D scans of the limestone surface to analyze those wear patterns. Those scans showed differences in depth smaller than a human hair. Every tiny groove became a clue about how players once moved their pieces. Then, the team brought in a special AI game simulation system designed to understand board games. They fed the system rules from about 100 historical games and asked it to test possibilities onto a digital copy of the Roman board. The AI played thousands of simulated matches against itself and tried different rule combinations each time. For every rule set, it tracked where the pieces moved and compared those paths to the wear patterns on the real stone. It repeated this process around 1,000 times per rule set until finally certain patterns started lining up perfectly. The system narrowed all the possibilities to a small group of related blocking games. In this type of strategy game, two players move pieces along fixed paths, trying to trap the opponent's pieces in corners or dead ends. If you've ever played tic-tac-toe or checkers, you already understand the basic idea. To control space, predict the opponent's next move, and close the trap. The simulations showed that the Romans most likely played this game with small tokens made of glass, bone, or pottery sliding along those carved grooves. And that discovery matters more than you might think. Historians used to believe blocking games appeared in early medieval Europe, centuries after the Roman Empire collapsed. But this limestone board showed them that such games existed nearly 1,000 years earlier. So, Roman players had strategy games that helped them develop forward planning, recognizing patterns, and thinking of different combinations and possibilities. Now let's travel even further back in time, long before Roman cities and writing of any kind. Our destination, Olduvai Gorge in northern Tanzania, one of the oldest important archaeological sites on Earth. In 2025, researchers studying the area found something unexpected in ancient sediments. It was a set of tools made from the limb bones of elephants and hippos. And these tools date back about 1.5 million years. Scientists found 27 bone tools, some nearly 15 inches long, shaped into sharp blades. Early humans most likely used them on animal carcasses or to process tough materials. At first glance, they seem simple, but it actually looks like the toolmakers shaped these bones using knapping, the same process used to chip stone tools. Knapping means striking a material carefully so that small flakes break away, gradually forming a sharp edge. Bone behaves very differently from stone. It contains collagen, which makes it slightly flexible and elastic. Hit the bone too hard and it shatters unpredictably. Hit it too softly and nothing happens. That means whoever made these tools understood how the material worked. They adapted their technique to shape bone without destroying it. Archaeologists believe Homo erectus, an early human species with body proportions similar to ours, created these implements. It also looks like the toolmakers preferred thick limb bones, which are the strongest parts of animal skeleton. To make that choice, you need to understand anatomy and material strength. Engineers today still use that same logic when choosing materials for machines. When we put all these discoveries together, we see that our ancestors designed systems, invented technologies, stored information, and played complex games long before modern civilization appeared. So we didn't just suddenly become intelligent. We've been building knowledge for tens of thousands of years. The Tower of London is the ultimate symbol of royal power. For nearly 1,000 years, it housed kings, queens, and the crown jewels. It served as a fortress, palace, and prison. It is one of the most studied and documented historic sites in the world. Yet, archaeologists uncovered unsettling human remains only 10 feet right under the walkway. Who were these people, and how did they stay hidden for so long? The Tower of London sits on the River Thames, in the heart of London. It's a true medieval castle with thick, well-preserved stone walls, armored gates, and watchtowers like you only see in movies. It was built almost a millennium ago, when William the Conqueror took control of England. He needed a fortress to lock the city down and send the message, "The new king is here, so better behave." The entire castle complex covers 18 acres, which is about the exact size of the White House grounds. It still keeps and displays the crown jewels under guard. The citadel was also a high-security prison for centuries, holding high-profile prisoners locked away. But it wasn't just a prison for humans. For centuries, the tower was a royal zoo filled with lions, elephants, and leopards. The king of Norway even sent a polar bear, which was allowed to swim in the Thames on a long leash to catch fish. One of the biggest attractions is the White Tower, a massive stone keep. Rising about 90 feet, it had been the tallest building in all of London for hundreds of years. Kings famously whitewashed the stones to make them gleam. It stood out like a blinding beacon above the dark, muddy city. Another must-see spot is the Chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, the tower's historic church. It served as the final resting place for famous prisoners and nobles alike. It was just outside of this very chapel that archaeologists made a chilling discovery. The mystery started in 2019 when a routine check uncovered 2 burials. When archaeologists returned to dig some more in 2025, the situation grew from unexpected to, hey, what is going on here? Over 20 skeletons were packed into the soil, mixed with fragments from older burials, proving this spot had been used and reused many times before. These graves span centuries, from the 1200s to the 1600s. So we're not looking at one tragedy. It seems to be a place that kept getting used again and again throughout medieval London. One situation feels like it's from a horror movie. A cluster of at least 6 people from the 1300s that looks unusually messy compared to the others. The timing lines up with the era of the Black Death in London, so this group could be plague-related. But researchers are careful with conclusions for now. On the other hand, some graves look the opposite of rushed. They look expensive. Several people were buried in coffins. In one case, the wood had rotted away completely, leaving behind a perfect shadow of a coffin stamped into the clay. The report says this coffin shadow likely held a juvenile buried in the 1200s. Then there's the chapel itself that might give us some clues. The current building is basically the newest version on this same spot. It's possible that there were 3 or 4 earlier chapels here, and the dig even exposed lost walls and an old floor surface deep down. But what else can we learn about these people? Here's where science can help. Researchers look at teeth. Your adult teeth form when you're a kid, and they lock in chemical traces from the water you drink and the food you ate. It basically creates a permanent record of where you grew up. So the team analyzed 2 specific skeletons. The first one seemed wealthier. The chemistry suggests they might have grown up in Wales and moved around a few times. They even had traces of a high-sugar diet. That was a huge luxury back then. The second person had a totally different story. Their bones showed signs of chronic stress and a much harder childhood. So these were 2 people from opposite ends of the social ladder. One rich and the other not so much. But they both ended up near each other to be discovered centuries later. Millions of people visit the Tower of London every year. They take selfies and walk the grounds, totally unaware that they might be standing on top of massive tombs. And that forces you to ask the obvious question. If a place this famous can hide ancient graveyards, what else is out there? Because the tower is definitely not the only landmark keeping secrets. In 2019, the fire at Notre Dame forced a massive rebuild. That construction forced workers to lift parts of the floor and reveal a spooky secret. Several tombs hiding 2 human-shaped lead sarcophagi, sealed like metal time capsules. And inside, there were details that shouldn't survive. Fabric, hair, and even leaves that were left on the head. This stuff points to an important person. It sounds unbelievable, but they managed to identify the person as Antoine de la Porte, a church official who passed away in 1710. The second coffin became its own mini detective story. Scientists nicknamed the man inside the Horseman because his bones showed signs of riding for years. Some new analysis suggests that he could have been Joachim du Bellay, a well-known poet from the 1500s. So, we have secret graves in London and Paris. That part almost makes sense. These are old, crowded cities where people have lived for centuries. But there's one place on Earth where history wasn't supposed to happen at all. Antarctica. Yes, almost literally the edge of the world with nothing human anywhere nearby for hundreds of miles. And still, in 1985, a Chilean scientist found human remains on an ice-free beach in Livingston Island on a spot now called Yamana Beach. A human skull in Antarctica sounds impossible, but the dates make it worse. When the remains were studied, the person appeared to be a young woman around 21, likely from the southern Chilean channels. She passed away in the early sealing area, roughly 1819 to 1825. That's basically the opening minutes of humans showing up in that region. So why would a young woman end up there? One idea is that she might have come with early sealers, maybe as a guide or part of the crew. The original researcher even suggested she could have been abandoned there for unknown reasons. Plus, the spot where they found her is known to have been visited by early 19th century sealers. The pieces fit together somewhat, but no one can really pin down the story. And it gets even stranger. The first discovery in 1985 was her skull, but later researchers came back to the same area and found more human bones. In 1988 and again in 1993, they recovered 2 femurs, basically thigh bones, near the original site. The big question is obvious. Were those bones from the same person, or did more than one person pass away here? The plan was to use DNA testing to check if the femurs matched the skull. If these 3 sites prove anything, it's that new discoveries could be anywhere. But the really exciting part is daydreaming about where we could go next. We are entering a phase where technology could make history feel like time travel. Think about what we can do with the gathered data. We can already pull DNA from a tooth to find out what someone ate or where they grew up. Maybe one day we could take that biological code and use AI to completely recreate a person. Imagine a digital human that looks just like them, with the right eye color, skin texture, and even scars. Then we combine that with the environment. Laser scanning allows us to map every inch of those buried foundations. If you feed that into a physics engine, you can rebuild the walls that fell down 500 years ago. That means in our lifetime, you might not just visit the Tower of London to see it as it is right now. You could strap on a headset and step inside the chapel as it looked in 1348, being face to face with history, just without the bad smells or the risk of catching the plague. There's something absolutely massive and deeply unsettling hiding right next to Stonehenge. More than a dozen giant pits carved into the ground. They're all spaced with eerie precision and form a perfect circle, more than a mile wide. For years, nobody could explain them. They were too big to be animal traps, too organized to be natural sinkholes, and way too deliberate to be random. And the biggest question was, who had the power, knowledge, and reason to reshape the land on this scale 4,000 years ago? So these pits surround a place called Durrington Walls, a huge Neolithic settlement just a short walk from Stonehenge. Archaeologists now say humans dug them around 2500 BCE, during the late Neolithic period, when people supposedly lived simple farming lives without metal tools, written language, or modern math. Each pit stretches about 30 feet across and plunges roughly 15 feet down, and together they form an almost flawless ring. To prove the pits weren't natural, scientists went full detective mode. They drilled soil cores and tested the dirt itself, including microscopic traces of ancient DNA and something called luminescence dating, which tells you when the soil last saw sunlight. Every test pointed to the same answer. Humans made these pits on purpose. Here's where it gets wild. The pits weren't dug randomly as people moved along. They were laid out as a single unified project. That means Neolithic builders had to visualize a massive circle, measure distances across open land, and coordinate teams over a huge area without any GPS, drones, or even aerial maps. All they had were people, ropes, wooden tools, and shared knowledge. So why would they invest so much effort and do this? Archaeologists think the pits formed part of a ritual landscape, not a practical one. Durrington Walls already looks like a place where people gathered for ceremonies, feasts, and seasonal events. The pit circle may have marked a sacred boundary. It could have separated ordinary land from a spiritually charged space. Some researchers think the pits symbolized a border between the world of the living and the underworld. The scale of the structure is pretty impressive. It may be one of the largest prehistoric monuments ever built in Britain, even bigger than Stonehenge itself when you look at the total area. And unlike Stonehenge's towering rocks, this monument stayed invisible for thousands of years, quietly hiding under the grass. Generations walked over it without knowing they were standing inside a gigantic ancient design. For a long time, we underestimated ancient people. We imagined them reacting to nature instead of shaping it. But discoveries like this keep proving that wrong. The builders of Durrington Walls didn't just live in the landscape, but engineered it. They thought in terms of geometry, symbolism, and long-term meaning. And this isn't the only case. All over the world, thanks to new technology, scientists keep finding proof that ancient humans worked on massive scales with shocking precision. In the Amazon rainforest, researchers found traces of 2,500-year-old cities hiding beneath the jungle canopy. Scientists spent more than 20 years exploring the area on foot before technology finally cracked the case. The LiDAR technology, which is like X-ray vision that surveys a landscape using lasers to digitally peel away the jungle, scanned a massive area of over 100 square miles. It helped to spot more than 6,000 rectangular earthen platforms, which are likely used as homes or public buildings. They also found agricultural terraces, drainage systems, and carefully shaped farmland. This wasn't a random settlement. It was well planned. At least 15 distinct settlements appeared, all connected by wide, straight roads that cut cleanly through the landscape. These roads didn't follow rivers or slopes as you'd expect. They crossed each other at perfect right angles, forming a grid. The researchers believe people from the Quillamope and Upanu cultures lived there between about 500 BCE and 300 to 600 CE. They farmed corn and sweet potatoes, reshaped the land, and built a system that lasted for centuries. Discoveries like this prove something huge. Far more people lived in the Amazon than scientists ever thought. Tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands. And they didn't just survive there, they engineered the landscape. Just like at Durrington Walls, the real story hid in plain sight until technology caught up. Then there's Peru, with one of archaeology's biggest headaches, the Nazca lines. These gigantic designs of animals, plants, and geometric shapes stretch across the earth like an ancient message, so huge that only birds or satellites can see them properly. For decades, people have tried to figure out why the Nazca people made them, how they did it, and what those massive patterns mean. And until recently, the mystery stayed stubbornly unsolved. Walking the desert or flying over it, archaeologists would spot lines and figures and wonder if anything was missing. But the ones already known were just the tip of the iceberg. Traditional fieldwork, with people on the ground slowly mapping things out by hand, took forever. And even then, dozens of smaller designs were just too faint for the unassisted eye. So, instead of scanning the desert on foot, researchers taught artificial intelligence how to see patterns in aerial and drone imagery. They fed terabytes of pictures into trained models, and AI began flagging shapes, curves, and ancient outlines that had been hiding for centuries. In just about 6 months, it identified 303 previously unknown geoglyphs in the Nazca Desert. It almost doubled the number of figures we knew before and showed entire classes of designs. Some of these new shapes are tiny, just a few feet across, but they sit next to giant ones like the hummingbird or monkey. Thanks to all the new finds, scientists can finally start testing theories they had about the purpose of the lines. It looks like the lines weren't just decorations. Many may have been walkways or routes used for ceremonial movement. In case you're worried, AI isn't replacing archaeologists. They still check every promising lead on the ground and interpret everything the machines find. Back in Britain, the pit circle also connects to an even older structure, an early Neolithic site called Robin Hood's Ball. Because it stood so far from the famous stones, it felt like a side character. But it turns out Robin Hood's Ball is from around 3600 BCE, which makes it about 500 years older than Stonehenge itself. It's what archaeologists call a causewayed enclosure, which sounds fancy but really means a big circular earthwork made of ditches and banks. Instead of one clean trench, the ditches are broken into short segments with little gaps in between. And instead of keeping people out, it probably brought them together. Archaeologists think these enclosures worked as gathering places, spots for meetings, feasts, rituals, and social bonding among the first farming communities. Then came the twist no one expected. While preparing land at Lark Hill, a hillside northeast of Stonehenge, for new military housing, archaeologists found signs of another causewayed enclosure. This discovery flipped the map upside down. The landscape wasn't growing outward from Stonehenge, it was already alive long before the stones ever went up. As researchers dug deeper, they found hundreds of flint tools, beautifully made leaf-shaped arrowheads, chunks of human skull, and pieces of antler, likely used as digging tools. Then came the pottery. Different styles showed up in different places, some from the enclosure ditches, others from nearby pits. That matters because pottery styles often act like cultural fingerprints. The mix suggests something big. Different groups of people were visiting the same place and brought their own traditions, tools, and objects with them. All of this changes how we see Stonehenge. The stones didn't appear out of nowhere. They rose in a landscape already loaded with meaning, memory, and movement. Every new discovery like the ones near Stonehenge, in the Amazon jungle and Peru, forces archaeologists to rewrite textbooks and the whole world to rethink the idea of progress. It turns out that ancient people made up for the absence of steel and electricity with observation, creativity, and shared meaning. They finally did it. After 300 years of searching, archaeologists pinned down the location of the lost land of the white jaguar, the city of Maya hidden in the wild jungles of Mexico. It all kicked off back in the 1500s with the Lacandon Maya. These guys were some super tough survivors who just didn't quit. When their main capital, Lacamtun, fell to the Spanish in 1586, most people would have called it game over, but not the Lacandon. Nope, they packed up, headed deeper into the rainforest, and built their last stronghold, Sacbalan. It was a hidden fortress of stone temples, twisty jungle trails, and howler monkeys acting like noisy little guards. For over 100 years, the Lacandon managed to keep their traditions alive there, far from European control. Then, in 1695, history came crashing in. A Spanish friar named Diego de Ribas stumbled into Sacbalan. And yeah, that was basically the beginning of the end. Soon after, the Spanish took over. By 1721, the Maya had abandoned Sacbalan. The jungle didn't waste time. It swallowed the place whole, with roots tearing into walls and vines smothering plazas. The city didn't just disappear, it got eaten alive. For the next 300 years, Sacbalan turned into more of a myth than a memory. A name archaeologists and explorers would whisper, secretly hoping to find it one day. Plenty of expeditions tried to track it down, but the rainforest is sneaky. Every path looks identical, maps fall apart in the humidity, and even GPS can't cut through the thick green ceiling. It was like looking for a needle in a haystack, except the haystack was alive, covered in thorns, and yeah, crawling with jaguars that would happily make you lunch. So how did the scientists crack the mystery? One word: a letter from the 17th century. The letter by Diego de Ribas described all the routes, rivers, and trails leading to Sacbalan. It showed in every detail the journey of the soldiers who walked 4 days to the Lakuntun River after leaving Sakbalan. Then they sailed for 2 days and arrived at the church El Encuentro de Cristo, left their canoes and continued on foot to Lake Petén Itzá in Guatemala. This was already detailed enough, but the scientists needed to pinpoint the exact location with geographic information systems. They took into account vegetation layers and how much each person was carrying to map an approximate range where Sakbalan should be. They fed this information to GIS and calculated where the city should be. And bingo, it worked. Archaeologists traveled through the jungle and found stone temples rising like broken teeth from the earth. There were also some tools and ceramics, and a Spanish church right in the middle of the ruins. The discovery isn't just about cool ruins, it rewrites history. For decades, people assumed the Lacandons simply scattered after Lakamtun fell, but Sakbalan proves they regrouped, fought, and preserved their culture for over a century more. It's like discovering the final chapter of a book we thought ended too soon. There's also irony here. The Spanish friar who revealed Sakbalan helped doom it. Yet his letter, centuries later, also helped save its memory. Today, the ruins sit inside a biosphere reserve, protected by the same jungle that once hid them. Tourists can't just waltz in. It's raw, tangled, alive. The city breathes again, but on its own terms. Scientists just uncovered another lost city, buried under the thick jungles of Mexico. It had been hiding there for 600 years. The place is called Gengola, and it's massive, about 360 hectares with more than 1,100 buildings, 2.5 miles of defensive walls, its own network of roads, and a super organized city plan. Because it was so deep in the jungle, you'd never realize how huge it really was unless you spent years hiking through it. But modern tech swooped in to save the day, using LiDAR, a kind of laser scanning tool. Researchers flew over the site, and in just 2 hours, they had a full 3D map of the entire city. Gengola was built sometime between 1350 and 1521, back in pre-Columbian times, and it used to be buzzing with life. It was a major hub for the Zapotec people, who had been around in the region since about 600 BCE. Families there lived in homes with big central patios surrounded by rooms, and as they got new members, they just add more rooms and stretch their houses out. They even used the mountains around them as natural walls and channeled mountain water for drainage. A lot of their buildings are still standing, which is wild considering how much time has passed. By the late 1400s, the Zapotec were real powerhouses along the Pacific coast. They even fought off the Aztecs, who were constantly trying to expand. At Gengola, they survived a brutal 7-month siege. But even though hiding in the mountains kept them safe, it wasn't perfect. They didn't have enough fresh water or farmland to feed everyone. Just 12 miles away, the smaller city of Tehuantepec had what they needed. So the Zapotec moved there right before the Spanish arrived in 1521. What the scientists have seen so far is just scratching the surface. That LiDAR scan revealed more than 1,000 buildings, and archaeologists are planning years of research to figure it all out. Instead of digging everything up and risking damage, they'll use advanced scanning tech to keep studying the city safely. Alright, now let's hop across the world to Egypt, where archaeologists stumbled on a whole lost city called Imet, tucked away in the eastern Nile Delta. The place was buried under layers of mud, water, and time, hiding in a swamp that's been shifting and changing for thousands of years. Scientists first noticed it from way up high in faint little clusters of mud brick foundations in satellite images. The shapes looked shaky and ghost-like, but too neat to be natural. So they followed the patterns down on the ground, started digging, and the city started coming back to life. They found multi-story tower houses, basically mini skyscrapers of the ancient world. They had multiple floors, thick foundations, and could handle some serious weight. That kind of vertical living is super rare in Egypt, especially outside the Nile Delta. It showed that people in Imet weren't just spreading across the land, but stacking upward, which means the city was packed, carefully planned, and way more urban than anyone thought for that time. And it wasn't just fancy housing either. Archaeologists also uncovered a grain processing center with paved work areas, animal pens, and organized spaces for food production. Clearly, this was a city with a real economy running behind it. Not far from there, they spotted a ceremonial road that once led to a temple for Wadjet, Imet's patron deity. But later on, other buildings got plunked down over the road, which shows that Wadjet's worship faded over time. Still, the ruins coughed up some amazing relics, a green faience little funerary figurine, and a stela showing Harpocrates perched on crocodiles and gripping snakes. He was the Greek spin on Horus, deity of silence, secrets, and the newborn sun. And there was even a bronze sistrum, an ancient Egyptian musical instrument decorated with twin heads of Hathor. Turns out, Imet was active from around the 4th century BCE onward, stretching from Egypt's late period into the Roman era. Its location along trade routes made it a magnet for merchants and pilgrims visiting Wadjet's temple. So it wasn't just hanging on, it was thriving, connecting, trading, and adapting with the times. And this isn't just another dusty ruin. Imet is giving us a window into everyday life, religion, and urban planning in the Delta, which we've always known way less about compared to the big pyramids and tombs.